it's going to be a bit of a long video anyway.
Okay.
Okay, so we're back again. Okay, let's start that one more time.
All right. Hi guys. I just had a question for my speechies this week because I was working with a little guy whom we were doing some handwriting practice in the context of their homework, and we had to write some sentences with their spelling words and then highlight the nouns and the verbs. And being an occupational therapist, I'm okay with this, but I wouldn't say I'm an expert. So I thought I'd just touch base with Marion just to get a little bit more information about how I can better teach that.
Yeah. Okay.
When I'm doing my handwriting.
Yeah, okay. So what Hannah's talking about here is, I guess, teaching vocabulary or new vocabulary while you're trying to do your teaching. So I wanted today to share with you our discussion because we're going to talk about what is the best way to learn new vocabulary and some tricks at the end. So it might be a bit of a long video, but if you can bear with us, there'll be some really good tricks at the end that would be great for your teachers to know, or also, you know, childcare workers and that kind of thing. So feel free to tag them in the video or share it with them. We'd love you to do that. So here it goes. Okay, so when we're doing vocab teaching, Hannah, how did you try to teach the child those words? Those two new. So noun and verb were the vocabulary that you were trying to
And
get there.
I think I was just trying to tell them what it was. So I knew that a noun was either a place, a thing, or a name. So I just used that.
Yeah.
And the same with verb. I kind of said it was a doing word.
Okay. So you've used a verbal description then to try and teach that vocabulary, which I think is something that we all do. We think, and what's tricky about that is it actually requires really good sound processing systems in our mind to learn that vocabulary naturally the way that everyone does. Now, when you're working with children who might have a developmental language disorder, we know the research says that it's about 1 in 14 kids might have difficulty with their language skills. So it's pretty common. We're looking at 2 kids in a classroom that might have difficulty with processing sound information and learning new words and learning vocab. So that's why this is so important. So what we want to do is, instead of just giving a description, because what does that rely on?
That relies on words.
More words. We're using words to describe words, which is really hard. So what we want to do is just have a bit of a look at what does it take to learn a new word. Now, I'm going to use an example that I used with a teacher just last week in a meeting. So again, learning new words, the teacher described to me that the boy in her classroom couldn't remember anybody's names. So he was having trouble learning his 28 classmates' names and his teachers' names as well. And the example that she gave was that he would come up to her, and I'm going to change the name so it's not the same, but he would come up and say, "Good morning, Mrs. and you could see he kind of knew that vocabulary label of her name, but just couldn't say back the sounds. And she wasn't sure whether that was an articulation difficulty or like maybe a memory thing. And what I wanted to do is just break it down for her. So let's use the pretend name that I've given this teacher is Mrs. Smitherson. So I've picked a really hard one, and hopefully no one that anybody knows. I don't know anyone of that name.
No, me either.
So Mrs. Smitherson. So let's have a look at it. What I want to do, everyone knows the Mrs. palette. Okay, so we can see that. That's pretty straightforward. Kids get used to that. This little guy was in nearly in middle primary, so he's used to calling people that. So that's not really part of the vocab teaching because that part's not new. When we look at then Smitherson, how many syllables are in Smitherson?
Smitherson.
Great. So we've got 3. So we've got 1, 2, and 3 syllables in Smitherson. So this is what we call the phonotactic structure of the words. And it's the syllables or the beats in the word, and also the structure of those syllables, consonant, vowels, and how they are built together. So this is what makes our language as English speakers pretty easy for us to process, because we know what English words, what their structure is and how they're built. This helps us make rhymes and poetry and things like that. Now, different languages have different syllable structures, and this is where, if I was to try and learn for example, an Asian language. They have very different syllable structures than we do, and I would find their words hard for me to learn because that doesn't come naturally to me. And it's quite similar when our kids have a language disorder. They may not naturally be able to just hear and process those syllables as quickly as we can, because we can just, it's natural, it's automatic, it's innate for us. Children with language disorders, it's not innate, it's not natural, so we have to help them break it down. So the first thing in teaching noun or verb or Smithson, whatever it is to look at the syllables and really maybe try and clap them out. Make sure you're definitely slowing down your rate of speech as well. So then the next part, once we've got that in our students' mind, we need to help them map on the sounds that go in each syllable. So then, I can't write upside down, so we've got Smithson, just like that. So now I'm using spelling here, but I'm not actually talking about spelling, I'm talking about our oral language here. So we need to map the sounds that we can hear onto those syllable structures. So there are some great techniques you can use to do this. Maybe you could use the phonics that you're using at school or at home. So if you're using Jolly Phonics and there's an action that goes with the sounds, you could use that. Another technique would be something like cued articulation. Now you can easily Google that. There's some resources out there, but cued articulation is a series of hand movements that match the sounds that we produce, and that's a really nice way to help the kids see and hear the sounds at the same time. So in Smithson we might go Smithson, and then you can kind of see the sounds that get mapped on at the same time as we hear them. Now, noun and verb is actually hard because they're both just a single syllable, and they're both a consonant, vowel, consonant word. So even though we hear them as completely different words, their phonotactic structure is the same. So that's hard. So I would be using lots of cueing. Nouns and verbs to help distinguish the difference between those two words. Now, of course, that's just learning the words themselves and how they are articulated. If we have a really clear process of that, then what we do is we match this with the mental image that the word is trying to teach us. So in the case of Mrs. Smithson, here she is, and we know who she is. In the case of nouns, great, isn't it? In the cases of nouns and verbs, you would match that maybe with some examples from magazines. You could cut out pictures and you could talk about those differences, or you could do what I always do and do a really impressive drawing of the vocabulary that you're trying to teach. But when we're teaching vocab, it's really important that we do both of those things. Otherwise, often what we find is our kids will have the concept, but they won't be able to articulate it. They won't be able to explain it to us and use that word. One of my Year 6 boys just last week was writing, and he was describing a historical speech, and he wrote it was fabulous instead of fabulous. And you can see what he did is he actually dropped that whole middle syllable because that's the way his brain processes that word. And when he articulates it, he actually loses it as well. So, you know, we really then, when we were editing, broke apart those words and had a look at those syllables. So it's understanding that words have a structure. They have sounds that map onto that structure, and then we need to link that with that mental image. So for the structure, slowing down, clapping out syllables. For the sounds, map them on nice and slowly. Use your tactile cues, use some cued articulation, talk about the sounds that are happening in your mouth, and then finally have a visual for the teaching of the mental image that matches that particular piece of vocab. So that's a really long explanation, but you could do that super quickly, 5 minutes at the start of your intervention session for nouns and verbs. You'd have it scribbled on a piece of paper next to you while you're doing that, so then you can focus on getting that handwriting goal in there, and you've supported the vocabulary level, so that's not interfering with what you're trying to achieve.
Great. I definitely can try that.
Great. Thanks.